A powerful explosion shattered the silence over the Arabian Gulf as flames erupted from the deck of a massive oil tanker transiting one of the most strategically vital shipping corridors on the planet. Sailors aboard vessels in the vicinity reported witnessing a massive fireball ascending into the sky while emergency alarms reverberated across maritime radio frequencies. Within minutes, urgent distress calls began flooding across the Gulf, confirming that a major incident had just occurred in one of the world's most critical energy transit routes. According to Iranian state media reports, naval forces affiliated with Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed responsibility for striking a U.S.-linked oil tanker navigating through the northern Persian Gulf. Iranian officials stated that the vessel had been successfully targeted and left ablaze in the water as part of what they described as retaliation amid the escalating confrontation in the region. The announcement immediately triggered shockwaves across global financial markets and military command centers worldwide. A strike against an oil tanker in the Gulf is not merely a localized military incident. It is a development with the potential to destabilize the very foundations of the global energy infrastructure. Before we examine in greater detail what precisely transpired during this strike, what Iran is asserting about the attack, and how this incident is already influencing oil prices across the United States, we encourage you to hit the like button and subscribe so you never miss the latest critical geopolitical developments shaping our world. The tanker that was reportedly struck was navigating waters that serve as a vital artery for global energy commerce. Every single day, enormous vessels laden with crude oil transit through the Gulf, transporting millions of barrels of energy supplies toward international markets. The Gulf region sits at the very heart of the global oil infrastructure. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates all export substantial quantities of crude oil through these waters. The tankers navigate through the narrow Strait of Hormuz before entering the Arabian Sea and proceeding toward refineries across the globe. That narrow corridor remains one of the most consequential choke points in international trade. Nearly 1/5 of the world's oil supply transits through this region. When a significant event occurs here, whether it is a military confrontation, a shipping disruption, or a tanker attack, energy markets respond without hesitation. That is precisely what unfolded following the reported strike. Iranian officials characterized the attack as a direct response to the broader confrontation escalating across the region. Iranian state media indicated that naval forces had deliberately targeted the tanker with the explicit intention of sending a message regarding control of Gulf waterways. In their official statements, Iranian commanders declared that vessels associated with their adversaries would no longer transit freely through the region should hostilities persist. The message was unmistakable. The waters of the Arabian Gulf had formally become part of the battlefield. The tanker that was reportedly struck began transmitting emergency distress signals shortly after the explosion. Reports emerging from the area indicated that flames rapidly spread across sections of the vessel as the crew desperately attempted to suppress the fire and stabilize the ship. Nearby vessels monitored the situation with grave concern while maritime authorities commenced coordinating emergency response operations. Meanwhile, analysts across the globe began raising a critical question. What does a deliberate attack on an oil tanker mean for the global economy? The answer is straightforward. It signals profound uncertainty. Energy markets are fundamentally dependent on stability and predictable, uninterrupted supply routes. When a tanker is attacked in one of the world's most critical shipping lanes, traders immediately begin calculating the probability that additional attacks could follow. And should attacks continue, the uninterrupted flow of oil through the region faces serious risk of disruption. The initial reaction came swiftly from energy traders monitoring oil futures markets. Within hours of the reports emerging, oil prices began rising sharply as concerns mounted that the conflict could interfere with global supply chains. Markets began pricing in the very real possibility that the Gulf could become untenable for commercial shipping operations. Seasoned oil traders understand that even minor disruptions within the Gulf can trigger substantial market reactions. The underlying logic is straightforward. If tankers cease moving, oil ceases moving. And when oil stops flowing, prices inevitably rise. Shipping companies began scrutinizing the situation with increasing urgency. Some vessels reduced speed along their routes while awaiting updated security assessments. Maritime organizations issued warnings that ships transiting through the region should exercise extreme vigilance. Insurance underwriters also began reassessing their coverage provisions for tankers operating in the area. War risk insurance is a mandatory requirement for vessels navigating through dangerous waters. When geopolitical tensions escalate, those insurance premiums can surge substantially. Elevated insurance costs translate directly into higher expenses for companies to transport oil, and those increased costs are ultimately passed on through fuel prices. The United States began registering the consequences almost immediately. Domestic energy markets reacted swiftly as traders anticipated disruptions in global supply chains. Diesel prices surged sharply, climbing past $4 per gallon for the first time in nearly 2 years as the conflict in the Middle East constricted fuel supplies. That sharp spike in diesel prices carries consequences far beyond the fuel pump. Diesel powers the backbone of the U.S. economy. Trucks delivering food to supermarkets operate on diesel. Freight trains transporting goods across the country are powered by diesel engines. Farmers operating agricultural machinery depend on diesel to plant and harvest their crops. When diesel prices rise, transportation costs escalate across the entire economic system. That means food prices increase, shipping costs climb, manufacturing expenses surge, and inflation pressures intensify. In other words, a tanker strike thousands of miles away can rapidly begin disrupting daily life for ordinary Americans. Energy analysts caution that the situation could deteriorate further should attacks on tankers persist. The Strait of Hormuz remains one of the most strategically sensitive energy choke points in the world. When shipping through the strait becomes hazardous or restricted, global oil supplies face dramatic tightening. Current data confirms that the conflict has already disrupted shipping across the region, compelling some vessels to reroute away from the Gulf entirely. Simultaneously, oil prices have already surged in response to fears of prolonged conflict and sustained shipping disruptions across the region. Market participants fully grasp the stakes. Should tankers be unable to safely transit through the Gulf, global oil supply could contract sharply. That prospect has prompted analysts to caution that oil prices could escalate dramatically if conditions worsen. Some projections indicate that crude oil could approach the $100 per barrel threshold should disruptions across the region persist. Such an increase would drive fuel prices significantly higher across the United States. Gasoline prices could spike sharply. Diesel prices could climb further still. Transportation costs would escalate. Airlines would absorb higher jet fuel expenditures. Shipping companies would see operational costs surge. The cascading effects would reverberate across the entire global economy. Simultaneously, military forces across the region moved into a heightened state of readiness. The United States Navy maintains a formidable presence in the Gulf, with the explicit mission of protecting vital shipping routes and safeguarding the free flow of energy supplies through the Strait of Hormuz. Following the reports of the tanker strike, naval patrols throughout the region intensified significantly. Warships commenced closer monitoring of shipping lanes while surveillance aircraft conducted extensive sweeps of the waters for additional threats. The challenge confronting military planners is considerable. The Gulf is densely trafficked with vessels. Oil tankers, cargo ships, fishing boats, and military assets all navigate the same congested waterways. Providing protection for every vessel transiting through the region presents an enormous operational challenge. That is precisely why tanker attacks have historically represented one of the most destabilizing developments in maritime conflict. They do not merely disable one vessel. They threaten the entire infrastructure that sustains global energy supply. The strike on the tanker also delivered a calculated strategic message. It demonstrated that the conflict has moved well beyond military installations and conventional land targets. Energy infrastructure and critical shipping routes are now squarely in the crosshairs. For Iran, targeting oil shipments represents a formidable instrument of leverage. By placing global energy supply under direct threat, Iran can exert pressure on its adversaries economically as well as militarily. For the United States and its allies, however, tanker attacks constitute a direct assault on the foundations of global commerce. That is precisely why incidents of this nature can rapidly accelerate tensions. Governments across the globe are monitoring developments in the Gulf with acute attention. Energy importing nations throughout Asia and Europe depend significantly on oil shipments transiting through these waters. Should shipping disruptions continue, those nations could confront energy shortages or dramatic price escalations. Some countries maintain strategic petroleum reserves as a buffer against supply disruptions. However, those reserves are finite. Should the conflict persist for an extended duration, even those strategic reserves may prove insufficient to stabilize markets. Within the United States, senior policymakers are closely tracking the impact of escalating fuel prices. Energy costs represent a fundamental driver of inflation and broader economic stability. Sharp increases in gasoline and diesel prices can rapidly evolve into significant political flashpoints. That is precisely why developments in the Arabian Gulf are being monitored with the utmost attention in Washington. For now, the situation remains highly fluid. The tanker that was reportedly struck remains the subject of intense international scrutiny as investigators work to establish the full extent of the damage and the precise circumstances surrounding the attack. Maritime authorities continue to advise vessels operating in the region to exercise maximum caution. Insurance underwriters are reassessing risk exposure. Energy traders are monitoring markets with vigilance while military forces remain at sustained high alert. The strike on the oil tanker may represent just one episode within a far broader conflict. but its consequences are already reverberating around the globe. From shipping lanes in the Arabian Gulf to fuel stations across the United States, the cascading effects are spreading with alarming speed. One explosion in the Gulf has served as a stark reminder of just how vulnerable global energy supply chains truly are. And as tensions continue to escalate, one fundamental question dominates the global conversation. Will this tanker strike remain an isolated incident, or does it signal the opening move of a broader and more sustained campaign targeting the global oil supply? Stay tuned for continuing coverage as the situation develops. And do not forget to like and subscribe so you never miss the latest critical geopolitical developments shaping the future of global energy markets.